Welcome everyone to the IFS Down Under podcast, where we have deep conversations with leaders in the IFS space and honour and share stories of homegrown Australian IFS therapists and practitioners. I'm your host, Oliver Brook, and I'm here today with my co-host, Suzanne Herity. Welcome, Suzanne. Good to be with you again.
Good to be here.
Yeah, great. Before I introduce you, Nicolay, I'm going to do an acknowledgement of country for the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and all First Nations people across Australia. We especially acknowledge the devastating legacy burdens in our society, which have been caused by colonisation. We acknowledge the devastating impact this has had on First Nations people, exiling their elders, healers, languages, practices, children and culture. And we acknowledge and respect their adaptive survival and their continuing protection of country, culture, language and healing practices. We pay our deepest respect to all their elders and healers, past, present and emerging. And we welcome all First Nations people to be part of this conversation and hold a hope for healing for us all. Today, Suzanne and I have pleasure in interviewing Niclés Bestel. Nicolay is a clinical psychologist and level 2 IFS therapist. We all met on our level 1 IFS training with Enat Bronstein and Paul Ginter. Nicolay is the practice director of Aspire Wellness and Psychology, a telehealth private practice dedicated to supporting clients with complex trauma and dissociative disorders using internal family systems. Nicolay has 16 years experience in supporting clients experiencing mental ill health, trauma, dissociation, distress, or disadvantage. She's passionate about increasing awareness around dissociation and trauma recovery, and her master's research was examining Australian psychologists' understanding of dissociation, and she has 2 articles pending publication on dissociation. Nicolay is also a guest lecturer in dissociation at Swinburne University. Nicolay identifies as a survivor of violence and loves the use of IFS for its non-pathologizing way of welcoming, affirming, and honouring all parts of people, places, and cultures. Welcome, Nicolay. Good to have you.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Suzanne. It's so good to be here with you.
Yeah. And yeah, great to be with you. And Nicolay, I just kind of say our intention of bringing you on here is both Suzanne and I are very interested in this topic, and through kind of our mutual supervision group that we're all in together, we got really curious about your knowledge around dissociation and your experience working with clients in this way and the research you've done. So we're really excited about this conversation and getting to know more about it. So I was wondering...
Yes, me too. Can't wait.
I was wondering, to start with, could you please tell us, before we get into that, what are your origins with IFS? How did you first come to this model, and did it become part of your personal healing journey, or was it mainly professional? Yeah, what could you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first kind of encountered IFS maybe 10 years ago, and I was in a therapy group at the time, and the facilitator mentioned it, and I was kind of interested in parts therapy, and she lent me a book, and I didn't make it through the book. It was Dick Swartz's book, but I think at the time my protectors weren't quite ready for me to read it and absorb the information. I returned it and politely pretended that I'd read it, but I hadn't. And then fast forward a few years, and I was doing some parts-based therapy, which kind of had a bit of an IFS twist, a bit of a lens, and I found it moderately helpful. But there was something missing, and I didn't quite know what that was. I later found out that it was self, and kind of a focus on self-energy. And the way that I kind of discovered that was when I was doing my master's in clinical psych. we had to do a certain number of hours, seminars, and you just had to rock up and kind of attend whatever was there. And one of them was run by Danielle Williamson and David Eckel, two fabulous IFS-based Melbourne therapists. And they started out that workshop by talking about their parts, just casually mentioning a timekeeper part, this part, or that part. And my system just sort of relaxed. It was just like, here is a way and a space and a modality for therapists to be people. You're a human, I'm a human, your parts are here, my parts are here. So from that moment, I really kind of dedicated myself to finding more about the model, did some workshops, swapped to personal IFS therapy, and started working with my own parts outside of that. Eventually did level 1 and level 2, and then started a practice focusing on using IFS specifically kind of in all the aspects of that: work with clients, work with colleagues, supervision, team meetings, kind of everything. Wanted to really infuse IFS into everything, because that's kind of just how it felt really good. It felt good for my parts. It felt good for the practice to have kind of self and acknowledgement of parts everywhere within the business. So that's how I came to IFS personally and professionally.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm curious about that, just as like a follow-up. So what impact has that had on you to kind of integrate it at that level? You've integrated into your own personal practice, you've integrated it in all the different kind of systems to do with your private practice. Yeah, what's that felt like, or what's that manifested as for you?
Well, it's funny because we're talking about dissociation, but it's felt like doing that, integrating it into my personal and professional life, avoided the kind of disconnection or dissociation that can sometimes happen between our own lives, like our personal lives as therapists, and then the work we do as therapists, and just kind of having it everywhere. Just feels like it's easier to be a human and a therapist, and move between those different kind of spaces, with more, for me, more authenticity.
Yeah, I really
Does
see
that
that.
sort of make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I noticed that in my own practice too. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, I'm just listening to your words and it's landing with me. And, what you said about it's an opportunity for therapists to be people. That just really sings to me, that this is about humanity rather than, being a therapist here and, having your personal life here. So I love the way that's kind of, I don't know the words, but it feels like a connection of two or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like a flowing and a fluidity.
Yeah. I'm curious about dissociation and the connection with IFS, but before I ask you that question, Nicolay, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how you define dissociation. I know that's probably a very big question.
Yeah,
but
it is.
What that means to you.
Yeah. There's lots of definitions of dissociation out there. They're long and they're wordy, but they're great. But I kind of really simplify it when I'm thinking about it and talking about it to just a disconnection between things that are usually connected, things that are usually associated, dissociated. and it happening in response to anything that overwhelms the system's capacity. So, very commonly happening in response to trauma and, car accidents, distress, abuse, but also in response to smaller things or less obviously impactful things that just overwhelm systems capacity or parts capacity in the moment. And so kind of thinking about dissociation really broadly, because it can be a disconnection in so many different parts of the world and people's experience. So, the really common one, like a disconnection in your sense of awareness, and you're driving and then you realize that you haven't remembered part of the trip, or you're watching a great movie and before you know it, 3 hours are gone. Our sense of awareness and maybe our sense of memory in those moments is temporarily dissociated. But then body, pain, feeling like part of your body is momentarily not there, or is taller, shorter, distorted in some way. Something is dissociated in our perception of the body or the world around us, where things feel momentarily unfamiliar. Or you maybe sitting at a cafe with a good friend, and suddenly you're like, oh, you're almost like a stranger, and then they're a good friend again. Emotions, kind of feeling numb in your body, but that you're actually really, really angry or really sad, but you can't connect to it in the moment. And then, maybe the kind of one that feels more dramatic, dissociated sense of identity. So, feeling like the part of me that went for a walk this morning is me, and the part of me that's here right now also being me. Or do they feel like they're not me? So that's not to say, in IFS we talk about parts all the time, and it's not to say if you have parts, your sense of identity is dissociated. But it's when that kind of continuous thread of me-ness, me over time, is either there or disconnected, dissociated, disrupted.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's how I kind of think about it, that those states of dissociation where you are numb or zoned out or kind of really slow, low in energy, but then also that dissociated identity, which doesn't necessarily come with those low energy states, but is also dissociation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm just wondering, for you, if you can tell us how, IFS interconnects with dissociation, or, what happens in people's systems, which leads to dissociated parts or systems of parts.
Yeah. So IFS, in my opinion, is one of the most beautifully positioned therapies to work with dissociation ever, because we already talk about dissociation. At least in some of its forms, we talk about and acknowledge and value our firefighters in particular, who are often parts who hold dissociative burdens or dissociative strategies, and who use dissociation to take us away from painful or overwhelming experiences by any means necessary. And there's not a huge amount of evidence yet in terms of using IFS with dissociation. That's not surprising, because there's not a huge amount of research being done on evidence-based treatments for dissociation, full stop. But what we do know is that IFS is effective in reducing dissociation in people with PTSD, and likely in people with dissociative disorders as well.
Yeah.
And there are some clinicians who will say you can't use IFS to treat dissociation. Generally speaking, those are people that maybe don't know all that much about the intricacies of IFS. So have concerns about maybe with IFS, is everyone going to suddenly be diagnosed with a dissociative disorder, for example? And so maybe, you know, don't have a clear understanding of dissociated parts and non-dissociated parts and how we work with parts in IFS. But, you know, Dick Swartz, Frank Anderson, a range of other people have been really effectively using IFS to work with all kinds of dissociation, including dissociative disorders and DID, for decades now.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I really liked what you said earlier around your definition of the simplified definition of dissociation is disconnection of something that used to be connected, something that used to be associated. And then you went through kind of that in relation to relationships, in relation to our body, in relation to our emotions, that there can be all these different disconnections. And I noticed that in my own system and in every client I sit with. So to some level, it sounds like we all have some sort of level of dissociation, or at least parts that have strategies that do it. And I'm just wondering, you know, could you talk more about the language around that? Because I have a part that used to think dissociation was to do with, you know, multiple personality disorder, and then I learned that it's changed, you know, the label to dissociative identity disorder. But what you're talking about sounds even more kind of non-pathologizing and ecologically sensitive, that actually it's on a micro level. There's all of this different disconnection in each person, and the identity stuff is a whole different thing. So I just wonder if you could talk more about the language around this.
Yeah. So, I mean, Ollie, I couldn't kind of have said it better. Like, everyone dissociates. You know, all of us have parts that have adopted some dissociative strategies, and they're really effective in disconnecting us from things. You know, maybe we used to think about dissociation as being, as being unhelpful, as being unevolved. Like, people do this thing, or parts do this thing of dissociating, and when they're healed, they won't do that anymore. And there's kind of this, sort of unintentionally, some shaming of dissociation and of parts that use dissociation, and, you know, by extension of parts of people whose systems extensively use dissociation. But dissociation can be a really powerful resource for healing as well, not just for surviving difficult or painful experiences, but for helping maintain functioning, improve functioning, and then also for healing. But so, coming back to the kind of question about language, I think about dissociation in terms of the experience. Other people might say the symptom of dissociation, but, symptom can be quite a pathologizing, medicalizing way to think about it. So the experience of dissociation. And then, working with people that have experienced a lot of trauma, and particularly complex trauma, there'll be people that use higher levels of dissociation. Their system of parts may have a dissociative structure, dissociative framework, dissociative way of organizing. And And then there are people that, if you're using diagnosis, might fit the category of a dissociative disorder. Dissociative identity disorder, depersonalization, derealization disorder, where something about the person or the world feels is dissociated, feels disconnected, feels strange or flat. So I guess if we're thinking about it as in its broadest term, we've got experience, and then somewhere along a sort of spectrum, we've got systems that use more and more dissociation, through to systems that might meet the criteria for a dissociative disorder. But any part within any of us might use really high levels of dissociation.
Yeah.
Does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, very much so, and adds a whole lot of other trailheads, which I'm curious about. Yeah, so I'll just give you an example from my own system. So I have this part who is called fog. And when I have an overwhelming experience or feel like someone is criticizing me, or another time that it comes up is when I feel in session that I've really done something wrong with my client and I suddenly get this wave of shame or embarrassment come up, fog will come in. And how I experience fog is literally like a fog, like it just kind of clouds over and takes out kind of vision, sensation, awareness, memory, kind of just wipes me out. And sometimes it can completely wipe me out. It's even put me to sleep a few times. And so what I'm understanding you're saying is that's a part with a dissociative strategy that uses that to numb shame or pain inside me. But that's not a dissociative system, or, you know, that part's not removing my memory, or, you know, I'm aware that they're there when they're taking me out. I've got this kind of dual awareness. I don't lose my sense of me. I just experience this fog.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering kind of what's the difference between parts that do that and then people, how would someone who hasn't actually a dissociative system, what would their sense be? Because I obviously don't have that in my system. So could you give us a feeling of what it might be like for them when it's not just a part taking them out, it's actually their whole system is dissociative, or
Yeah. So I'm gonna answer that question in two ways, because there's not a really straightforward answer. Because some systems will have a dissociative structure, but they may not have a dissociated sense of identity. So, you know, in that example, there may be multiple parts that use dissociation as a strategy for coping, for managing intense, overwhelming emotions, but also dissociation may be used by managers to compartmentalize information, to not know things or not feel things. So in a reactive and a proactive way, dissociation being used as a strategy. But if in that example, someone can still feel like their sense of identity is not dissociated, so they can still feel like those parts are broadly me. Yeah. So the separate kind of so if that's not the case, someone can have a dissociative structure to their system and can feel like those parts are not me. And so there's although when we think about dissociative disorders, and especially DID, that sense of identity being dissociated is really important. Actually, I kind of think more broadly just about whether the system has a dissociative structure or dissociative framework, because sense of identity being dissociated, well, it's not an all or nothing. So some parts will be dissociated and feel like they are really separate from the person, and some parts won't be dissociated and will feel like they are part of that person's continuous sense of identity, even in a system with DID. So that's why like the answer to that question is actually like quite complex, because people are complex, and because people's systems are complex, and because our parts develop really beautifully creative ways of managing, and even in a highly dissociative system, there's multiple different ways needed to help someone cope and live life. I sometimes think about it like, imagine a rock, a stone cabin in the woods somewhere. And so like the walls are made up of all these different stones, which we might think of as parts. Some of those parts will use a dissociative strategy, a firefighter, like a zoning out part, a scrolling through TikTok part, using sex or drugs to take away from the pain of the moment. But then in a dissociative system, the support beams are also dissociation, and the foundation is dissociation, and maybe the moss that's kind of stuffed between each stone to keep it all warm and cozy is also dissociation. So the system has been built around keeping everything separate, keeping information separate, skills separate, knowledge, emotions, memories, and in some cases identity separate from other parts to help survival.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's
that makes
beautiful answer. Yeah.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And you know, even when you were saying about like just describing the house made of stone, and you know, the stones being representative of parts that dissociate, I guess what I'm hearing you say is, and I, you know, you've said this already, it sounds like dissociation is quite common in all of our systems, you know, even if we don't have DID. But I'm wondering from your perspective as well, Nicolay, you know, and I know mostly you work with people who have DID, but how common is it? How common are, you know, I guess DID or structural dissociative systems?
Yeah. So pretty common. So stepping back a moment, dissociation as the experience or the symptom is super common. 17% of college students, like uni students, will say, I have significant dissociative experiences when they're asked about them. You know, when they're, you know, we always do research on college students because they're so available for research. You know, that's almost 20%. And at least 50% of adults will experience a really significant episode of depersonalization or derealization, feeling like they're not themselves or something about the world is not themselves, like significant enough to temporarily really impact their functioning across their lifetime. So that's at least half of us. But in terms of dissociative disorders, so DID, and the more commonly diagnosed other specified dissociative disorder, which is a range of experiences, including, you know, some experiences of prisoner of war camps or brainwashing or torture, but also most commonly diagnosed for people who meet the criteria for DID but don't have amnesia that goes with it. So thinking about there's 4 kind of main dissociative disorders, and it's about 10% of people in clinical populations will meet the criteria for one or more of them. And that would be high. It's higher again in certain populations. So if maybe you work with lots of people who've experienced family violence, or
Mhm.
people doing sex work, or childhood trauma, it will be higher again. In some studies, up to 40%. So
40%.
40%.
That really surprises me. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is extremely, overwhelmingly under-recognized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I did some research for my master's, which was looking at Australian psychologists' understanding of dissociation and sort of recognition of the symptoms, but also what training they'd received in, if any, in dissociation. And in terms of training, very little. Less than half had received even like a single lecture. So it's not covered in, it's not required to be covered in psychology courses. That's the same with counselling, with psychiatry in Australia and around the world. So there's very little training. So unsurprisingly, most people don't recognise the symptoms, so can't then go on to, if they're working with a diagnostic framework, can't then go on to assess for a dissociative disorder. In our study, it was about 1 in 5 could recognise all the symptoms.
Yeah.
Which means that 4 in 5 couldn't.
Wow. Wow.
So when people say dissociation is really rare, or, I don't encounter it in my practice, there's a part of me always jumping up saying, wait, are you sure? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Are you actually really sure? Are you
Yeah.
sure that you're not seeing it? Are you sure that it's not going on? Are you sure that it's not going under your radar?
Yeah.
Yeah,
wow.
well, by that broad definition you used at the start, I can't think of a client that I see that doesn't have at least a part that uses some sort of dissociative strategy.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah. Like, I know even in my own system, I've got a number of parts that use a number of strategies to dissociate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all do.
Yeah. It's like a continuum, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, with in regards to people who have dissociative systems, and I'm wondering about how self shows up for those people.
Yeah.
And what your experience of that is.
Yeah. So self is present in all dissociative systems, just like in all non-dissociative systems, and is present in their parts too. I have heard, people within the IFS world say, if you're working with a client with a dissociative disorder, don't expect to find big self, that global sense of self. Only look for self energy within individual parts. And I respectfully and vehemently disagree with that. My clinical experience working with people in dissociative systems and people with dissociative disorders is that self is there, but therapist blindness, or therapists not expecting to find self. If we're not looking for something, we won't see it. And chances are, it's challenging for most of our clients and for most of us when we initially are exposed to IFS, to get our heads around this idea of self and to recognize it within our own systems and our body, and to recognize the feeling of it when it shows up. It's no different for dissociative systems. So it's definitely absolutely there, but sometimes it might take a little bit of extra time for clients to start to recognize it. And it may and sometimes within dissociative systems, protector parts, typically managers, are fearful of self showing up, because if the system has been organized to stay separate, to stay dissociated, to not connect, the presence of self can be particularly scary. It can feel really risky for parts, because self is about connecting, and self is about knowing and feeling and being. So if therapists working with a dissociative system look for big self, they'll absolutely find it. And they'll also find small self within, individual parts. But initially, the critical mass of self energy that we need for healing may initially come primarily from the therapist, rather than the client, until the client has more support with that. I guess just in terms of, working with clients with a dissociative disorder, especially DID, they've usually come from other therapies, because we know that people with a dissociative disorder tend to spend years looking for recognition of their dissociation and looking for therapies that's going to be effective. And so they will sometimes have other terms that they might use initially that can seem, and therapists might wonder how that fits in with self. So it's really common for clients to say, to talk about a host part, or if they've done some schema therapy, to talk about a healthy adult mode, or if they've come from structural dissociation, they might talk about an ANP part, or a primary manager, or a CEO part. And in those other therapies, often that part, almost always a manager, is the part of the person that's been labeled, recognized, appointed as the day-to-day person, if you like, the part that's around most of the time, and the part that is being resourced to be around all of the time. And so often clients come to IFS therapy initially saying, well, this part that I've been told by other therapists is the part. This must be self. But it's not usually self. it's almost never self. It's usually a manager that may have some self energy, but a really burdened manager that has taken on enormous responsibilities for organizing the system and getting the person to therapy and maybe managing daily life, and has a real focus on healing. But also will be using dissociation as a strategy.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is that it just takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time. Yeah. And I guess that's, well, in my experience anyway, that's really common. And even in my own system, you know, it taking time to even trust self, or believe that it is a possibility, that is part of, you know, who I am or who somebody else is, or that it's always there. It's just that the access to it is not necessarily available, and that just takes time. And especially when, you know, people have come from you know, previous therapies where, you know, there's different, you know, phrases and words. It can take a little bit of time to kind of, let's say, unpack that, or, you know, dissolve it a little bit, you know. Yeah,
Definitely.
I'm just wondering, you know, in addition to that, Nicolay, in people's systems that have DID, it's quite clear that they can have dissociated parts, but they also have non-dissociated parts.
Yeah. So people with a dissociative disorder, DID, or one of the other dissociative disorders, will almost always have dissociated parts that feel very separate from them and separate from each other. And then they'll have non-dissociated parts, which are the parts that as IFS therapists we might be most familiar with, or you might be familiar with from your systems as well. And it's one of the really essential things to, you know, to kind of provide some education around for dissociative systems, highly dissociative systems, because their experience generally is of highly separated parts that may not share information, may not share skills. So a part may know how to drive and another part may not know how to drive. Sense of identity may be dissociated, so they may very much not feel like the same person. They may not be aware of other parts within the system. And so if you're sitting in a session with a client with a dissociative disorder, and maybe they're telling you a story about an argument they had with their partner, you might, you know, you might be listening and you might be like, oh, you know, it sounded like, from an IFS thing, you might kind of say, it sounded like an angry part then came in to try and protect the other part. The part that was feeling sad or hurt by the argument. And the client might respond with, oh no, that was me. That was me, the part called Julie. And if you were sitting with you know, that client, and you were kind of offering that, and they said, no, you know, we are trained in IFS to honor the client's experience and wisdom of their system. So often what happens is IFS therapists will follow the client's awareness of their dissociated parts. And because the client doesn't have an awareness yet of their non-dissociated parts, those parts don't get attended to. Those parts don't get acknowledged, don't get validated, don't get witnessed, don't get unburdened. So helping in the same way that we help a client that comes to us for IFS and depression, we help them learn how to identify their non-dissociated parts. We need to do that with dissociative clients as well. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Really appreciating all of what you're saying, Nicolay, and just having to kind of process as we're interviewing you, because some of this information is really new for my system, and I'm really, what parts are really taking that in. and also doing like a self-assessment of my system and then clients that I'm sitting with. So got some dual processes going on as I sit with you. Healthy and good. It makes me very curious about a number of things, which I'm going to have to drop some of them. But one of them is, and I might just try and summarize this and you can maybe follow up after. But the sense that I'm getting is dissociation is just this completely healthy response that humans have to experiencing pain or suffering or some sort of hurt, whether it's relational or from an incident, car accident, flooding, whatever it might be. And that we all do it to survive and to cope with stress or pain or hurt. But if you experience an overwhelming amount of one of those things, like continuous family violence or a natural disaster or childhood abuse or something like that, if it's frequent enough that your system can then take this on in a global way, that it then uses that strategy in its whole framework. Because to be connected in an environment or a situation like that would be just too painful, too overwhelming for the person. And so their whole system goes, okay, well, that's not safe. It's not safe to be in self. It's not safe to be connected. It's not safe to have my heart open. So I'm just going to dissociate all my parts and structures so that pain never gets to me, or at least it's lessened in some way. And this is what I'm understanding from you, that there's nothing pathological about that, that's just like a normal process that anyone would go through if they suffered enough in that way or were overwhelmed in that way, that their system would slowly defend itself by dissociating. That's what I'm getting from this. And it's really releasing a lot of shame around any kind of thing that my system has done to defend itself by dissociating, because I'm realizing that maybe there's a lot more dissociating there than I ever thought, and from my clients. And so, yeah, could you speak to that a little bit? Because that's just kind of a summary of how I'm processing what you're telling me.
Yeah, I think, Ollie, I think that was a beautiful summary. I very much believe that dissociation is a normal and expected response to coping with overwhelming experiences. And it is a really effective way of getting through things that we might otherwise not be able to get through. High levels of dissociation are really strongly associated with significant childhood pain and distress, trauma, abuse, sexual abuse. And children can't survive overwhelming experiences without the strategies, the limited strategies that are available to us as children. We can't get away, we can't usually seek help from people outside of the family or outside of the community. The primary way that we can cope is by changing something about how we're experiencing the situation. And dissociation doesn't just allow survival, but it allows a higher level of functioning and existing and being in the world than we would otherwise have. So if a part of us is able to go to school without memories of feeling terrified by violence the night before, a part of us might be able to learn some things at school, might be able to connect with a teacher or make a friend. And that allows us to be able to be in the world, paradoxically disconnecting from some things allows us to connect with the world in ways that might otherwise be available to us.
I'm getting some tingles in my body as you say that. Yeah, that's a really honorable way of seeing it, I think, and a gift, seeing it as a gift, and a skill and a resource.
Yeah. I think it is a gift and a skill and a resource, like I said earlier, that we can use not just for survival and not just for getting through, but that helps, for a lot of people, actually helps them with their healing process. In a highly dissociated system that maybe has memories of severe abuse or torture, it wouldn't be possible for many parts to be able to be fully witnessed and unburdened if all of the dissociative structures that were in place fell away. Because for there to be enough self-energy to witness and validate and help a part unburden, you can't have memories of 15 years of horror also sitting right there. It's not that self-energy can't hold 15 years of horror, but other parts can't hold that because they're so burdened.
Yeah.
So compartmentalizing things, keeping some things dissociated, allows for the healing to unfold. And so rather than us shaming ourselves or clients that dissociate, I definitely believe in honoring the resource and honoring the pacing that dissociated system might require to keep things titrated at a manageable pace, to gradually allow memories or parts to be uncovered and unfurled, to completely honor if they say no, not yet, can't go there, because the structure of dissociation has helped that person survive and is helping them in the healing.
That's great. And so kind of leading on from what you've just said, most of our audience are IFS therapists, I imagine, and some of them might be IFS clients, or people interested in IFS. But for the IFS therapists that are listening, do we just do classic IFS with people who have dissociative parts, or is there something else that what you've told us is so helpful because it kind of just shifts a perspective and shifts the way of viewing dissociative parts and strategies, which I can already feel is de-shaming, it's kind of depathologizing, and also makes me feel more courage in being with people who have dissociative parts. But is there actually something practically that we could do differently in IFS therapy that would be helpful in working with people experiencing themselves like in this way?
Yeah. So the foundations of IFS still work beautifully with dissociative systems and dissociative clients. It is essential that we're explicitly acknowledging dissociation from part, like used by parts as a strategy, but also if there is a dissociative structure to the system. If we're not really explicitly acknowledging it with clients, largely therapy is not as effective, which sort of makes sense if you think about it, because dissociation is about not connecting, not knowing, and explicitly naming things helps them to be known, and gives our client systems more permission to be in the space. Helps with that de-shaming, but also helps with the building connections between different parts within the system and also between parts and self. And it's really essential for IFS therapists. We're very commonly IFS clients as well. But when we're working as therapists, to attend to our own parts, especially our own dissociative parts, and any parts in our systems that are scared of dissociation. So often our managers might be polarized with some of our dissociative parts. And it's especially important because in the same way that kind of self-energy brings more self-energy, dissociation in clients can trigger dissociation in us. Our dissociative parts can step in, or our managers can be like, oh, there's something going on here, and rush to help us. In general, with clients with a dissociative structure to their system, the work will be longer, because there may be more parts, or if there's not more parts to the system, the parts are more separate. So it takes more time to help parts reconnect, build trusting relationships with self, collaborative relationships between the system. And although we don't commonly do a huge amount of stabilization or resourcing in IFS, in traditional standard IFS, sometimes we need to do more of that when working with dissociative systems. Once again, that's not because self-energy within that client doesn't have the capacity to hold and integrate the information and the experience and fully support their parts. It's because parts within the system, particularly manager parts, the ones that have probably shown up for therapy and are doing daily life stuff, may have really fluctuating skills and resources to draw on. There may be external violence. They may still be experiencing ongoing abuse, for example, from childhood into adulthood, or periodically when they return to visit family. And quite commonly in systems that have experienced extreme trauma or abuse, there may be intra-part violence. So parts using strategies of violence on the inside to silence or to protect or to punish other parts. And so there's often not a foundation of safety. There's often not a foundation of sufficient safety for protectors to relax enough to allow therapists to connect to them, to help the client connect to them, and then to allow access to exiles. So safety frameworks on the outside, but also very importantly on the inside, are really important. And strategies like helping clients to establish a safe place, helping parts within each client, if necessary, to establish their own self place on the outside, but also sometimes on the inside, even before they might be able to be retrieved, if a retrieval might need to happen, to help bring, we don't need total safety, just enough safety, a sense of safety felt within the body and being able to be tapped into by parts to allow witnessing. Sometimes the step of witnessing won't initially be done from self. So it may be that a self-like part initially will witness because they're available to witness and there isn't sufficient big self-energy available yet. What that tends to do is reduce distress and reduce some of the burden, partial unburdening, and allows a little bit more space in the system for more big self energy to flow, and often then we'd return and re-witness and fully unburden from self. So that's not always required, but it's often an intermediate step that we might modify.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that is often different is that in a dissociative system, protectors usually, not always, but usually need full witnessing and unburdening in a similar way to exiles, that although they might be a manager holding a critical strategy or an anxiety strategy or a people-pleasing strategy, they've probably either experienced or held the awareness of significant trauma or distress, and so are a manager, but also have highly distressing content that needs unburdening.
Yeah. What's really, really standing out for me from what you've said, Nicolay, is that that piece around safety, stabilization, and resourcing being a really important component as well, which we may not, have a lot of in the IFS way of working. But what it does remind me of is somatic IFS, and how in somatic IFS there is a little bit more stabilization and resourcing used with the body, and with Suzanne's body of work, and the using those internal resources like our breath or movement or self-touch to really find or support safety in the body. And it's it's something I know myself I weave in to the work that I do, which sounds very similar to what you're describing. And I'm just wondering, in addition to that, that's something, that's really valuable. I'm wondering, with people who have dissociative systems, is there anything that you don't do, or that you steer away from, or, that's a little bit different to to working in an IFS kind of way or informed way?
Yeah. So with some clients, the strategies from somatic IFS are a beautiful, really stabilizing resource. There are other clients who initially can't tolerate anything related to the body. And so that it's not a hard and fast rule. It's a really, really respectfully checking out what the client's system can tolerate, and also what individual parts within that can tolerate, because for some parts, highly dissociated parts, they're not connected to the body at all. And they might be a long way off being connected to the body. And so the body is not a resource. The body is a terrifying place that they do not want to inhabit. So for some clients, breathing and touch are really helpful. And for other clients, they may never be part of that person or that part's IFS journey. Even often, like maybe at the start of an IFS session, we might say something like, maybe take sit back in your chair and take in a couple of breaths. And for some clients and for some parts, that means they're not going to come back. Just that brief mention of the body. So being really mindful of that. And being really cautious with strategies that might have crept into some IFS approaches from other that have kind of we've adopted from outside. So things like the conference room technique, encouraging dissociative system to bring all the parts together into a space, a conference room, or a forest clearing, or a visualization to encourage connection between parts. I'm usually extremely cautious of that because the system has been set up to keep parts separate and to keep the information and memories separate. And then the therapist comes along and says, join together into this space, and that can feel really overwhelming and can trigger a lot of intense polarizations, lots of unintentional criticism, verbal violence between parts. It can generate a lot of unsafety in the system. And there's usually, in the early stages of therapy, there's not enough knowledge, and there's not enough safety, and there's not enough equality between parts. So some parts, voices are going to be louder or scarier, and others are going to not feel safe to show up or not be able to speak. So approach with caution, that one. And I guess the last thing is around grounding strategies, which we haven't spoken about. I don't, as a general rule, I don't use grounding strategies extensively with dissociative clients. Within IFS, you were in the same training as me. I'm sure you remember Aynat saying, when we use a grounding strategy, we inadvertently often send a message to that part saying, you're not welcome. What you hold is too intense. Please go away. And of course, we don't want to do that. However, in the early stages of therapy with a dissociative client, sometimes it's helpful to teach them some grounding strategies that they can employ outside of sessions if they're feeling really overwhelmed. Because particularly outside of sessions where there's not therapist self-energy helping support their own self-energy and helping them be with that part, actually it might be too overwhelming for their system to connect with that part in that moment. And I said that was the last thing, but actually there's one more thing in terms of what not to do, and that is don't rush the healing process. Often managers show up really, really eager to feel better, to feel different, to not feel the pain and the chaos. And then parts kind of get a taste of this beautiful self-energy coming from the therapist and maybe from their own system, and they kind of tumble out really wanting that experience, wanting not to feel the pain or the agony that they've been in. And before you know it, lots and lots of stuff has been opened up. Lots of different memories of trauma, lots of different polarizations, and things can become really chaotic for the person and for their parts. And so it's not that we absolutely want to honor the client's system's wisdom around pacing. And we also want to balance that with knowing that parts are coming through kind of not caring about the system's wisdom for pacing. They're just desperate for relief and support. And so finding a way to really honor and acknowledge parts without without leaving it in a space where 30 or 50 or 100 parts have been acknowledged and their trauma is right there.
Yeah, it makes sense to go really slow. Yeah. I'm really, I guess what's resonating with me, or what I'm hearing is, making sure that we get full permission in whatever way that we want to work with somebody, that, the person themselves and their parts, they're in the driver's seat,
Yeah.
So important.
So important.
Especially as IFS therapists, when we're learning new ways of working with people, and we want to try something new like that, we have to be willing to accept that it might be a no. Yeah.
That's right.
So Nicolay, this has been such an amazing interview, and there's so much here. I feel like we could keep talking for another couple of hours, and maybe we will do another session in the future, I hope. I'm just wondering, was there anything we didn't ask you that you wanted to kind of share today? So a last thing that you want us to know about before we kind of start to come to a close?
I mean, maybe like the question of, is it worth learning more about dissociation? And the answer that I would give is yes, absolutely. As therapists and as IFS therapists, we're learning, and there's so many things that we might be interested in, and so many different ways we can support our own parts and support our clients and their parts. But dissociation is so common in all of us and in our clients. And although it maybe can initially feel a bit strange or a bit scary, actually it's not. So I would encourage IFS therapists and IFS clients to learn more about dissociation and about the ways their system uses dissociation, so we can better know and support ourselves and our parts and those of our clients.
Yeah, well said. And I think this, what you've shared with us today is a big step for anyone listening to kind of move towards that. And is there any sort of particular resources or people that you suggest people listen to or learn more from? And also yourself, how would you like people to get in touch? Is that something you'd be wanting, or do you have a website or anything you could offer? So other people and then yourself.
Sure. So in terms of other resources, specifically around IFS and dissociation, there's not a huge amount out there. There will be more in the future. But for right now, although it's not specifically focused entirely on dissociation, Frank Anderson's Transcending Trauma, and Frank Anderson's work more generally, he focuses a lot on dissociation and on working with dissociative parts. People like CC Sykes and others that do a lot of work around really supportive and affirming ways to work with polarizations and firefighters. I think those are probably the key resources that I would recommend and really endorse. In terms of connecting with me, I would love that. I always like to talk about dissociation, always like to talk about IFS. People can get in touch through my website, aspirewellnesspsychology.com.au, for, you know, sharing resources, supervision, whatever else. So really happy for people to get in touch.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I will definitely put both of those people, Frank Anderson and C. Sykes, and your website in the show notes, so people can just scroll down and click on that if you want to learn more. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess just, you know, to say to you, Nicolay, thank you so much for saying yes to the call. And it's been so insightful and so interesting, and you know, it really, I'm even more intrigued now than I was before.
Mm.
And I really want to know more. So yeah, just on behalf of myself and my own parts, and I can't speak for Ollie, but I'm sure he will speak for himself. But it's been really, really rich and nourishing, and yeah, it's just been so good to hear from your experience and the contribution that you're making to this, you know, my words have lost me now, but it's like this world that you're in, you know, the contribution. And I just have a sense of excitement for what's to come and what's going to unfold for you out of this. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Suzanne. That's really lovely. And I was just going to say, it's been such a delight to be here with you, and to talk about this.
Yeah.
You know, we working with dissociative parts and clients, we focus on building communication and ways of talking, and you know, at a broader level, that's also what we're doing here, just by talking about this stuff and kind of bringing it into our language and our thinking.
Yeah.
And it's always a delight to chat to the both of you as well, and for my parts to sit with your parts. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, you're really welcome, Nicolay. No, it's been a beautiful interview, and a real reshuffling from my own system about how I view dissociation, and it feels really hopeful and helpful what you've shared with us today. So yeah, thanks so much, and yeah, look forward to collaborating more.
Me too.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.